Welcome back, guys. We are on to the last part of chapter 56, so this is part 4. And here we're going to again zoom out another level and really talk a little bit about what's happening to our global biosphere as a result of human activity. And what we're looking at here is by the changes that we're doing on a global level, what does that mean then for the preservation of certain species as we move forward? And what we see is a lot of the current models that are out there for conservation aren't necessarily going to be suitable for the species that are there in the future, assuming that we don't really make a global effort to stop what's happening at the scale of our biosphere. And a lot of these human changes are things like the nitrogen and phosphorus causing the algal blooms, which is what the nutrient enrichment is there about. The accumulation of toxins, so bioaccumulation, biological magnification of different poisons and toxins up the food chain, your climate change, and then the ozone depletion. So when we talk about nutrient enrichment, we're dealing with the addition of nutrients at one location and that movement of those nutrients to somewhere else. And a lot of this happens via our farming techniques. So a lot of agriculture, the way that we're currently doing it, draws a lot of nutrients out of the soil every harvest season. And so we're constantly needing to replace those depleted nutrients in the soil to continue to grow our crops in that area. And so we add tons and tons of fertilizers. The problem is that we are more often than not adding way more nutrients back than are maybe truly necessary. And so that stuff is going to get washed away. And what we end up with is dealing with this critical load. And so what we need to do is be more aware of what are the actual nutrients necessary, what can those plants actually absorb, and if we can maximize that critical load, only giving those plants what they actually need, then we can keep from damaging our ecosystems. So right now the problem is we're adding way more than that critical load. It's ending up in our groundwaters, it's ending up as runoff into streams, which ultimately make it to rivers, ultimately making it to our oceans. And it's that runoff and that sewage that is causing these phytoplankton blooms or algal blooms. And here's off the coast of Texas and Mississippi, you get the Mississippi River, Louisiana's down here, okay? And in the wintertime, where we're not doing quite as much farming, because your farming is going on up here in the plains, it's cold, it's not really feasible to do it in the wintertime. All right, the algal populations are relatively minimal, not that there's not stuff still happening, because you're still getting residual runoff. But you go into the summertime and their populations just explode, and so you're causing these dead zones because they're depleting the environment of oxygen, and you get all the fish die off, which is a problem because if you know anything about local economy down here, a lot of that's based on fishing, and so it's just causing cascades of issues, not just ecologically, but economically as well. Then you have the toxins, right? We release a lot of synthetics into our environment, pesticides, herbicides, all sorts of things, and these end up in our food chains. All right, and so you're dealing with biological magnification where we go up each level and the amount of that pesticide or whatever that chemical happens to be increases in concentration. And the problem with a lot of this is that these toxins end up being fat soluble. What does that mean? That means it gets stuck in the fats of the organisms. So our phytoplankton here at the bottom of the food chain, very low amount, but it gets stuck in their tissues. So when the zooplankton eat them, now they have a higher concentration, gets stuck in the zooplankton's tissue, so the smaller fish have a higher level, again stuck in the tissues, so the trout have an even higher level, and we get all the way up to sort of those top organisms in our food chains, and the concentration has just grown every level. And so you end up seeing vastly larger amounts of that pesticide in concentration in each organism as you go up. This is one reason we almost killed off our national symbol. All right, the bald eagle had similar problems to what these herrings are being shown in the picture. And the biological magnification of these toxins going up the food chain was thinning out the eggs and was not allowing them to be viable. All right, and so this is something we have to be very conscious of. Just knowing that this stuff doesn't just kind of dissipate as we put it out into the environment. In fact, it's getting concentrated as it goes up the food chain. And then your greenhouse gases and sort of their connection to global climate change. And this is the one that gets talked about probably most often. It's really just the idea that we're burning all these fossil fuels, and one of the major byproducts of doing that is CO2. CO2's got to go somewhere when we're burning things, and it ends up in our atmosphere. So there's been some arguments in the past saying, well, we'll just plant more plants. The plants need the CO2 to go through photosynthesis, so they'll pull it out of the air and kind of fix the whole problem. Well, that's great, and we should continue to plant plants and allow them to do that. The problem, however, is that we're finding that the other limiting nutrients, the nitrogen and those sorts of things that are necessary in the soils, are limiting the plant growth, which then is limiting how much CO2 those plants can actually take up at a time. So it's not a perfect solution. It's certainly something we should continue to be doing, but we're putting way more CO2 into the atmosphere over time than the plants are actually capable of taking back out. So while we can use it as sort of a management technique, it's not going to take care of the whole problem, and so we've got to look elsewhere. And of course, CO2 then gets connected to your greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect in and of itself is actually very much necessary, very important for why life exists here on Earth. All right, we need that CO2, the water vapor, your other greenhouse gases that are creating this sort of blanket, if you will, around the globe, and keeping the heat that's coming in from our solar radiation from re-radiating back out. And that's necessary. We need that to a certain level in order to keep the Earth's surface at a temperature that is habitable. All right. Problem is that we're increasing those concentrations, and the more that we're increasing that over what should naturally be there, the more we're seeing increasing global temperatures as a whole. All right, and that's affecting everything from weather patterns to our ocean currents to our wind currents. All right, and keep in mind that when we're talking about increasing temperature, we're talking globally. All right, there are areas that are seeing fluctuations, so they're having lower than average temperatures, but as a whole, the global temperature is increasing. And the biggest problem here is that a lot of our organisms aren't going to be able to survive the changes that are happening as rapidly as they're happening. And that's because as these weather patterns and these temperatures change, we're shifting, globally speaking, where these organisms are best suited. And so a lot of our larger organisms, things that can literally pick themselves up and move, are in fact shifting their natural ranges. But there are plants and smaller organisms that can't possibly move themselves fast enough. So one of the things they're looking at is assisted migration, where they are literally picking up species, whether they're plant or insect or something smaller that can't move quick enough, and transplanting them to more favorable habitats that are beyond where historically their native range should be. Problem is, we can only do that for so long before we run out of places to take them. Okay, so one of the ways that we're looking at combating this is looking at renewable sources of energy. And again, economically, we know we're running out of fossil fuels, and so we've got to find other sustainable ways to create energy. We've created a society very much dependent on that. But it's a money issue, it's a government political issue. All right, and again, it's not going to necessarily be sustainable if one country does it, but nobody else does, or a handful of countries do it, but globally we don't make an international effort to do it. So, how do you weigh what's necessary for the globe versus what's necessary and culturally acceptable for other countries? And also tied into all of this is our depletion of our ozone layer. Just like greenhouse effect is necessary to keep life on Earth within reason, the ozone layer is very much a vital piece to all of this. And your ozone layer's whole purpose is to protect us as living things from the damaging effects that UV radiation has on us, and very much not just us as a whole organism, but even more specifically at a cellular level, to keep that UV radiation from damaging our DNA. All right, it wasn't until the ozone layer sort of developed over time in our very early Earth that we were finally able to create DNA and then ultimately evolve to what you see now. If that ozone layer had never come about, life wouldn't be here. All right, this would be a very sterile planet. So we need that ozone layer to keep us going. And we noticed back in the mid 1970s, once we were starting to put up satellites and really study the globe outside of being here on Earth, that we were noticing that that layer was thinning. All right, and the connection really came back to these chlorofluorocarbons, or these CFCs, that we were utilizing a lot in things like our cars as coolants, our refrigerators as coolants. Problem is that those CFCs contain chlorine, and those chlorine atoms interact with the oxygen, the O2 that's already in our atmosphere, or excuse me, the ozone, the O3 that's in our atmosphere, bumps off oxygen, which doesn't sound so bad, but it's depleting the ozone. All right, and so we end up with this sort of cycle that goes on and continuing to build up chlorine, and it just gets stuck in this vicious cycle. And what we ended up seeing is that we were thinning out the ozone layer. So here's Antarctica, and this was a particular place where it was very bad in our southern hemisphere. And here's 1979. All right, we fast forward to 2009, and look at that huge hole that's going on. Okay. And so we were seeing these ozone layers decreasing anywhere from 2 to 10% over the past 20 years. It's causing, again, a lack of ability for us to be protected from that UV radiation causing DNA damage, right, particularly in our primary producers who are trying to take in that solar radiation at certain levels because it's what they need in order to go through photosynthesis and have our primary productivity. And so we're seeing damage in our plants, our phytoplankton, obviously other organisms as well, but that effect at what's going on at that primary production level then trickles up the food chain. And so 1987, there was in fact an international agreement, and over time it has been shrinking this hole again. All right, so we are seeing improvements based on that agreement. It's not closed up completely, but we're getting there. So not only do we need sort of just international agreement on things, but there are different ecosystem services that are being put in place by different countries across the globe as a way to help protect these natural ecosystems, the species that live there, and then ultimately the hope here is that we're creating a much more sustainable future. And so these systems include all sorts of things like purification of our air and water, so treatment plants and what's required before factories can dump things into the water, our emissions standards, that kind of idea, the detoxification, the decomp of different wastes. All right. Being conscious of the nutrients we're putting in, trying to get farmers to be better educated and more understanding of the nutrients they're putting on their plants and what's really necessary. All right, as well as with the ultimate hope that we're going to kind of moderate these weather extremes as well. All right, things like Hurricane Katrina and Sandy and all those devastations are a result of what we're doing globally to our atmosphere. All right, and so if we can understand what we're doing, slow it down, hopefully we can then kind of bring our weather back to a little bit more of a normal state. Ultimately, the goal is sustainable development. All right, nobody, I think, is naive enough to think that we are going to completely erase what we have done, completely get rid of our current standards of living, and sort of live off the grid, if you will, moving forward. That's not feasible. We know that. So, sustainable development is really this push that's out there to continue meeting the societal and cultural needs that people have developed, while limiting the impact that we're having so that future generations can continue to meet their needs without completely destroying the planet. So the idea here is, how do we really best manage the resources that Earth is giving us in meeting the needs that we have? And so we have the Sustainable Biodiversity Initiative out there, where its whole purpose is to define what our needs are, how do we acquire them, and how do we get them in sort of an intelligent and responsible way so that when we're developing, we're managing, we're conserving Earth's resources while still meeting the needs that we have. And it's really just being smart about what we're using, how we're using it, how we're disposing of it. All right, and so that's kind of the take-home message to all of this, is recognizing what we're doing, finding better ways to do it, so that our future generations aren't left with a mess that is irreversible.